Welcome once again. In the first two videos of the respiratory system, we focused on the structures and their functions, just the overall structure of the respiratory system, the lungs, placement in the body, and then we looked at the mechanics of breathing and how those lungs function to get air down into the alveoli. The next topic we looked at was the alveoli themselves and how they are specialized for their function. And we left that topic off with an introduction to external respiration. This video focuses on what happens next. After external respiration, after the oxygen gets into the blood, how is oxygen transported to capillary beds? Why does it leave capillary beds to go into the tissue's fluids? And then why does carbon dioxide come back, and how is it transported back to the alveoli for exhalation? So let me introduce it this way. If we say that this is an alveolus here, and we'll just draw a single line. We know it's a one cell thick, but we just represent it as one line. And we'll say that this whole board space is blood, and we have to divide it, I suppose, to say that the top half can be arterial blood, so oxygen will come out of the alveolus, be transported to tissue spaces, and this can be a capillary over here. And we'll draw that capillary edge like that. And this, of course, then this can be the cells on that side. Okay? So if you understand my diagram, I think we're ready to get started with this topic. The alveolus fills with air during inhalation. Oxygen diffuses into blood. The reason it diffuses into the blood is because there isn't any oxygen in the blood. It's lower than the concentration in the air. Remember, this is, say, 21%, and the percentage of oxygen, the partial pressure, we talk about partial pressures when we have gases in a fluid. Partial pressure of oxygen is less, so it diffuses in to the blood. When it's in the blood, it bonds onto hemoglobin. The product of that is abbreviated this way. Its name is oxyhemoglobin. This highlights the fact that hemoglobin is a very, very specialized transport molecule. If you remember in a previous video, we mentioned that hemoglobin can actually bond onto 4 oxygens. So oxyhemoglobin, if blood is fully oxygenated, or 96%, 98% oxygenated, which is fairly typical, 98% of the bonding sites of all the hemoglobin molecules on all the red blood cells would be transporting oxygen. We just abbreviate it that way, however. One thing that we have to consider before we go any further is, just get a different color here, what the conditions are like, the conditions of the blood are like near the alveolus. The blood has a pH of very close to 7.38. It's slightly alkaline. The temperature here, I'll put temperature above the line, not that it matters. Temperature is around 37 degrees Celsius. That's very important to recognize. And the reason it's important to recognize is that these are the conditions under which oxygen bonds to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is that quaternary shaped protein. It has a particular configuration that allows oxygen to bond to it at that temperature and at that pH. When we get down to cells, those conditions aren't the same. The cells of our bodies, they're muscle cells or they're very active, and the activity alone causes the temperature to slightly elevate. So I'm going to suggest 38 degrees. And also the activity of the cells in generating metabolic acids lowers the pH a tiny little bit. So the pH might be 7.35. That's all fine and dandy. The blood flows from the lung tissue through the left atrium, left ventricle of the heart, out the aorta, and onto a tissue capillary, systemic capillary. And that's what this is, the capillary here. What happens at this temperature and this pH is that hemoglobin slightly reconfigures itself. It doesn't denature, but it does change shape just a little bit, and that changed shape of hemoglobin allows it to release the oxygen. So what quite simply happens is hemoglobin releases the oxygen, and the oxygen diffuses into, not into the cells, but into the fluid around the cells. Okay, I'll draw cells like that. So it goes into the fluid here. And you might consider, why does it go into the fluid? Well, the cells are constantly using oxygen. They get the oxygen from the fluid. So as oxygen levels decrease in the fluid, as they're being consumed by the cells, oxygen concentration decreases, oxygen gets drawn in simply, again, by diffusion. The hemoglobin is not doing anything. The hemoglobin leaves the fluid of the capillary bed here, and it heads on its way, still part of the red blood cells, of course, on its way back to the alveolus. Now, the other part of this story is what goes on in the cells, because the cells are producing carbon dioxide. They're also producing ammonia. We aren't considering ammonia in this topic. Ammonia becomes a consideration in the urinary system because the liver converts it to urea. And urea is that part of urine. But we are worried, not worried, but concerned about this. Carbon dioxide is not a very safe thing to transport in the blood in this fashion. There's an enzyme present on red blood cells. I'll represent a red blood cell like this. That enzyme is carbonic anhydrase. And what happens with carbonic anhydrase is carbon dioxide actually combines with water. I'm going to draw a chemical equation backwards here. When it combines with water, what happens is it makes carbonic acid. Carbonic acid. And carbonic anhydrase, I'll put a Ca here, is the enzyme that catalyzes that particular step. Carbonic anhydrase isn't a very stable acid, or carbonic acid isn't a very stable acid. It immediately breaks down. And when it breaks down, it forms hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. Bicarbonate ions, they're okay in blood. That's fine. It's just a part of a salt. It's a base. This is not okay in blood because if you think about it, if you lower the pH, and that could be contributing a little bit to that slightly lowering pH there. If you lower the pH of blood, it's a condition known as acidosis, and the proteins denature, and that's not very good. So we luckily happen to have a transport protein right here that isn't doing anything. Hemoglobin dropped off its oxygen. It's not doing anything. So this gets picked up by the hemoglobin. And it winds up producing what's abbreviated as HB, which is known as reduced hemoglobin. there's a little bit of carbon dioxide that gets transported by hemoglobin as well. So we have to consider this. HB, hemoglobin, will also pick up carbon dioxide, and it produces, I'll draw the reaction this way because we're going that way, it produces HbCO2, and the name of this one is carb, for the carb, aminohemoglobin, because the carbon dioxide is attached to a particular amino acid in the hemoglobin. This is known as carb aminohemoglobin, like that. So now if we look at it, we can see that the carbon dioxide is transported back towards the lungs in actually 3 ways, if you can pick out all the 3 ways. I'll circle them here. This is part of it here. It's being transported back, carbaminohemoglobin. It's being transported back as part of bicarbonate ions. Bicarbonate ions buffer the blood, of course it prevents pH changes. And there's a little tiny bit that gets transported back just as carbon dioxide. Some doesn't get bonded onto anything, so it's safely transported back there. So by the time we get the blood going back towards the heart, up through the vena cava, right atrium, right ventricle, gets pumped out the pulmonary artery to pulmonary arterioles, to the alveolus, we have the oxygen, the carbon dioxide being transported in 1, 2, 3 different ways. And we actually have to reverse those processes. So what happens up here is carbon dioxide is released from here by this reaction going that way. If you see what's happening. Under these conditions, this ion and this ion will reform carbonic acid, and carbonic anhydrase will conduct the reaction that way. This is a reversible reaction. So that reaction gets totally reversed, so we regenerate the carbon dioxide that was contained in this molecule. So this carbon dioxide is the same ones that entered that reaction. There's some carbon dioxide that did not go through that. It got transported back as a gas. So carbon dioxide comes from the bicarbonate ions. The carbon dioxide that was transported as a gas itself. And there's also the carbon dioxide that gets transported by the hemoglobin, the carbaminohemoglobin. So these sources of carbon dioxide right there, there, and there. We should mention something about the reduced hemoglobin. In order for this reaction to reverse, this reaction must also reverse. So reduced hemoglobin will release its hydrogen, and that hydrogen combines with that, the remaining part of this molecule to make water. And of course water can diffuse out. The hemoglobin itself is now free. The hemoglobin can complete the cycle right there. This hemoglobin can continue in the blood, go over the surface of the alveolus, and as it does, oxygen diffuses in, it'll pick up the oxygen, and away it goes. The carbon dioxide can diffuse out because the concentration of carbon dioxide in the plasma is greater than the 0.04% or whatever it is in the air. Very little carbon dioxide in the air. So the carbon dioxide concentration here is higher. Let's just recap this and make sure we recognize the important parts of it. Critical to recognize the difference in temperature and pH. At these temperatures and pHs here and there, hemoglobin acts differently. The hemoglobin coming back under these conditions will release carbon dioxide. So it releases it here. But under these conditions, it will bond onto oxygen. The opposite is true here. Under these conditions of 38 and 7.35, hemoglobin releases the oxygen and it can actually pick up carbon dioxide. This reaction, carbonic anhydrase reaction, is very, very important because it allows carbon dioxide to be transported in a safe manner. Of course, to generate that safe manner, we generate hydrogen ions, which also have to be transported in a safe manner. So we have reduced hemoglobin. There's only one more video in this series, and in that one we'll look at what can go wrong. Thank you very much.